All right. Well, thanks again, everybody, for coming out tonight, taking some time to come over here and listen to me talk. Tonight we're going to go through a few different things as far as routine maintenance and every day on your bike. It can be a pretty complex thing. There's a lot of different things on your bike that can go wrong, make noises, and things that can slow you down basically while you're riding or cause things not to shift right. And it's kind of a little bit of a problem-solving action or reaction type thing on what makes it do what. First thing we're going to get into is overall is the cleaning of the bike. Let's see here. So as far as how clean you keep your bike or how often that you need to clean it, all is based off of where you ride, how often you ride, and the conditions that you're riding in. Obviously, if you're riding in a muddy, dirty mountain bike type thing, you want to clean your bike a little bit more often. You can imagine the grit and grime and everything that gets down the bearings, and it just causes more wear on it than someone that's out on clean roads or riding on a smooth paved path all the time. So starting off, this is kind of the things that you need on an everyday basis while you're cleaning your bike. Some sort of stand. A lot of people just have something they prop it up. I've seen people more or less wedge their back tire in between the door frame and the door and hold their bike up and hold it steady. You can't beat a nice stand and bring them up to your level while you're working on it. Rags. You've got, I usually keep two different rags around, one for actually working on wheelie stuff, getting the chains and stuff, and then anything that's got grease on it. And then a polish rag for whenever you're actually going into final cleaning on everything. Kind of a soap or a degreaser. So this is a pretty good degreaser, but it's also chemical free, so it's bio-friendly. But it gets in there. The degreaser is mainly used getting around the pivot points around your chain. And it can get some, if you have any kind of grease debris from the chain, between wax or excess lube, it typically builds up around the chain area and around the bottom bracket. It helps cut through that, something that a simple rag and a polish can't always get off. Brushes, there's a lot of different types for getting in different places. You've got some brushes here for getting around the tires. You just want to be careful not to use too deep of or firm of a bristle brush. If you were to take this and rub it on your frame, it can cause scratches. And then you've got small, well, here if I have one. I think I have one out of a package up here somewhere. These are show. Basically a little toothbrush, more or less. This gets in between the cogs, and it actually has a knurled edge that you can really, if you have anything, any sticks wedged in places, you can get that in there. And then the polish. This something after you get done with the cleaning, you spray it on. Most of your polishes are Teflon based, so once you wipe it on there, you can actually spray. Once you get it on there, it has a buildup that it puts on there. You can wipe it down. It almost works as a wax. You go back and buff it afterwards, and it puts a polish on there that dirt doesn't stick to. So after you clean your bike, it stays clean longer whenever you do that. As far as every day out riding about, there's you just want to make sure your bolts obviously are secure on the bike. Once it's cleaned, it starts getting into the tuning phase of it. Just any kind of Allen wrench. You can more or less build a bike with just some pretty basic tools. Allen wrench is the one you're going to use the most. Almost every bike on the bike, or every bolt on the bike, will be either a 4, 5, or 6 millimeter Allen wrench. In some cases, some of the older bikes have crankset bolts down here that'll use an 8 millimeter, but for the most part, you just have 3 tools really to use on an everyday basis. Good and bad to tightening versus over tightening. If you have any bikes that have carbon parts on them, I know Brian, you've got a lot of your carbon handlebars, stuff like that. If you over tighten up here at the handlebar stem, you can actually crush the carbon. It's made to take such clamping force, but not too much. So you just want to go through and make sure that it's snug but not over tightened. Handlebars, stem, brake bolts, and crank bolts are the ones that usually need some attention more often than others. And I'm just kind of rushing through this a little quick. I mostly meant to do some question and answer type stuff overall for the evening. All the threads on all the bolts as well, whenever you are tightening them. There's a difference between oil and grease between them. Your coarse thread bolts, like what you would find on your pedals, you want to put a thicker grease on whenever you're tightening stuff up. Fine thread bolts, like up in the handlebar stem, you just want to put a light oil on. I did bring out a couple of examples of the things between the oil and grease whenever you're going through and lubing everything. Like this is a cable that I just found an old bike basically in the back that has more or less been abandoned. Someone didn't want to fix it. It had a lot of stuff wrong with it. So that's just a cable around a housing, not moving. You can kind of pass that around. That's pretty seized up. I mean, it'll work, but it's not going to work as good as something that's lubed up properly. And this is a cable. Once you actually, it should just fall like that. You shouldn't have to put a lot of friction on there. Another example here of cleaning the bike. A lot of people sweat more than others, so sodium buildup on aluminum. It can seize up things. This derailleur right here came off of a guy's bike. He's actually just in here looking at some shoes, and I was laughing. I said, I saved your, it's probably 5 years ago you replaced this. I don't know why I still have it, but it worked out good for tonight to show off. He sweats a lot, and just an aluminum part. Well, he didn't keep it clean, so to actually move this, you have to force it side to side. It just seized up. Whereas one that's working properly should just snap back into place. So if your cables are like that, and there's just multipliers, things that go in there. If your cables are seized up, if you have friction built up in your pivot points, like this thing here can't be fixed. Once the salt gets in there and it erodes and gets in the bushings, I mean, we lubed this thing, we boiled it in hot water, anything to try to break the sweat down, and it was just toast. You can't, I mean, you can fix them to a certain point, but after a while, they're just gone. Derailleur pulleys are another spot where you get some friction at. Back here as a chain runs through that. A lot of people overlook it. They don't see it as being a bearing that's in the bike, but it's just a bushing. But it still is a source of a lot of friction if it's not maintained properly. And this is not the pinnacle of technology for a derailleur. This is just a cheapie that I've gotten out of an old part somewhere. But the bottom pulley I have here, that's serviced right. And then I kind of exaggerated the calls of this right here. There's a lot of them that just seize up like this naturally. I had to make this one seize up just because I didn't want everybody to pass around a real greasy, nasty part. And you can kind of just spin those wheels right there and see the different amounts of friction that run through there. And same goes for the chain. The chain can actually be a source of friction if it's not cleaned and maintained properly. The difference between a clean chain and a dirty chain can be 3% actually power draw on the bike while you're pedaling it, and that's even more so than that. But if you take the wattage output of a rider, say 250 watts for an average, or maybe even a little bit above average rider to hold for a pretty steady basis, a dirty chain can cause you 7.5 watts, which is pretty noticeable whenever you're actually getting on there pedaling. So as far as key things that you want to keep oiled up, obviously clean and lube chain, any pivot points that revolve around the drivetrain, because this is where you're going to have most of your maintenance at, is around the drivetrain right there. Anything that moves while you're pedaling the bike, whether it be in the cogs right here you're passing around, the links in between the chain, as far as getting that cleaned out and re-lubed. You can't over-lube a chain. You don't want too much on there. Whenever you take whatever you end up choosing to lube it with, I like the wet lube on it. It just depends on how often you maintain it. There's 3 different types of lubes. There's a wet, there's a dry, and there's a wax. And really it's just kind of what conditions you're riding in, and the name of the lube tells you what it's for. Wet lubes are for not dusty conditions where you have snow, water, mud. They protect the chain and don't gather a lot of dirt on it. And dry, dusty conditions, you want to use a dry lube. Now, dry loops take about 3 to 4 hours to dry once you put them on. So you have to do that in plenty of time before you go riding. You have to put it on and then wait for it to dry for it to actually work the way it's designed to work. Wax loops work like a wet loop does, but it just has a wax layer that builds up over top of it. I don't like wax loops because they tend to leave your chain really, really dirty and gunk. Just a layer of dirt and gunk built up over top of it. They're meant to be cleaned before you re-wax them. Most people don't. They just keep applying it over there and it just builds up real thick. Which I think your bike had, whenever I was working on it, I scraped a bunch of wax off the derailleur cogs that was built up on there just, I think, yesterday. So, I mean, I like the standard either wet or dry lube. I just avoid the wax for most people, unless you're really going to stay up on top of your maintaining your bike on a really, really regular basis. Like I say, I designed this to really be a lot more question and answer type stuff, so if anybody has anything they want to talk about. I'm not a good public speaking person, but I can answer questions like a champ.
Bikes with dissimilar materials like stainless steel bolts and titanium frames, you put grease on the bolts before you put them in on everything?
Yes and no. I use a anti-seize. Shimano makes a product called Lock Knot, and one bottle of it has literally lasted me over 10 years. I've had the same bottle of it. Just has a little paintbrush in it that you just paint onto the frames or onto the threads of the bolts. Typically you see a lot of it with aluminum and titanium is where you see a lot of seized up problems. It's a problem called cold welding. It's just the metals of dissimilar properties fused together. But that's where you see it mostly at is aluminum and titanium. Carbon fiber is another one. A lot of people think of just, well, put a layer of grease in it, especially on the seat post into the frame. You don't want to put grease on carbon fiber. There's actually a product called carbon paste, which is, it's kind of like an anti-seize, almost a sandy grit inside of it. It's made to reduce the clamping forces, so you don't have to damage your carbon parts. You can tighten them down without, and have the holding power without having to have the excess torque.
What kind of grease do you use on the wheel bearings, Ryan? Or how often should you disassemble the wheel bearings?
It depends on the type of wheel bearing. There's two different setups on it. The sealed cartridge bearings that some people pop the seals out on those, flush them, re-grease them. You can do that. Sealed cartridge bearings were ideally made for ease of swapping out. You just take a bearing remover, pop them out, pop a new one in, and it's already sealed, ready to go. But then some of them are like a much higher end, like a ceramic bearing. I know for guys, I have a Finish Line ceramic grease that I put in there, and you just got to put just the right amount. You don't want to overpack it or it'll start pushing the seals out. For regular wheel bearings, I just use a nice, just a part grease for non-ceramic stuff. It does high and low heats both, and it's very water resilient. Anywhere you're going to have a bearing on it, it's pretty well going to have some kind of a dust seal. Like these wheels right here have there's a seal onto the hub flange inside here, and there's a little rubber seal actually that keeps dust out on top of that. So it's a double sealed mechanism versus a sealed cartridge bearing.
What's that stuff you put on mine for the noise when you take it all apart?
Oh, like on what your seat post was?
No, yeah, that and on down for the suspension.
Oh, for that, you just use a standard grease.
Same stuff.
You want to use something a little bit heavier on things like that. Like what you had on yours was just basically a torque issue with the bolt, but it was a fine thread and it wasn't letting it torque tight enough.
Oh, okay.
Really, it was having a creaking noise. If bolts are too loose on a bike, you can get two different metals actually kind of rubbing together, just barely moving, but it makes a popping and creaking, crackling sound as you ride the bike, and it can be a booger to find, really. You can have a noise that sounds like it's coming out of here and coming out of the back end of the bike. The tubes on a lot of the modern bikes they're large diameter, hollow tubes, and noises travel and echo throughout the frame, and it can be difficult to pinpoint where a noise is coming from. Usually you can find it, you have a pretty good idea of what it is, but I've had some take a little bit longer than others to find.
You were talking about cleaning your chain. You go ahead and use water and stuff, soap and water, and clean your chain.
I use a degreaser whenever I clean the chain off. Usually in the shop area, what I do, we actually have a parts cleaner, and we take the chain completely off the bike and have a solvent cleaner, and then we take an air compressor, blow all the solvent out, let it air dry. Usually pretty good while. We want to make sure it's good and dry and cleaned out before we reapply any lube, because that solvent, if it's not all the way out, it'll actually act as a thinner and thin out the lube that we're trying to put on there.
But you don't want to do that very often.
It's like an oil change for your car. I mean, the cleaner and fresher it is, the happier it is.
Is that the best way to clean the chain, take it off?
Yeah, it's the best way to do it because you can scrub into it a little bit more in detail. Park does make a on-the-bike chain cleaner, the
Yeah.
Cyclone, and it wraps around the chain when you put it on there. And it actually has a series of brushes and sponges inside here that are supposed to get in there, and it does a pretty good job of cleaning it. It's just, if you're gonna work on your bike and clean it, this is the very first thing you wanna do because it will make a mess. And you need to clean everything else on top of it. There's a reservoir down in here where you put your cleaner, you run it through there, and then flush that out. And then you put some hot soapy water in there, and you probably run the chain through it 5 or 6 times after that before this water starts coming out or stops coming out black. You want it to come out pretty clean, or maybe just a real light gray. At a certain point, I mean, you can exhaust yourself trying to get the chain perfectly clean, because but getting the grease and dirt off the plates is not the problem. It's getting the dirt and grease out of the bushings in between, around the pins, is the thing that you'll almost never get out.
So that's a better one than the top one there.
What's that? This is a
That's
brush.
That's what I have. But
That's a brush that you dip down into a solvent, and then basically it's a similar thing without the actual solvent container being on there. It doesn't get in there quite as good as what that Cyclone does. But we actually take the, and I was showing Dan this before, we actually pop the chain off. Most of the chains on modern bikes anyway have a master link on them. Find it here. Here it is. And we'll actually just pop the chain off. And comes off easy as that, and you have your chain fully off the bike, and we just dip it down into the parts cleaner. We'll roll it up and scrub it on both sides and actually spray it out with a pressurized solvent and get out of everything in between the pins and bushings. And we'll let it hang like that and dry. Make sure all the solvent's off there, and then put the lube back on there and let it hang and in for quite a while before wiping off the excess. That's another thing on lubricants. You always want to wipe off any kind of excess that doesn't sling around on the bike. If it slings around, it's probably going to get back in this area, down on the bottom bracket. Difficult areas to clean, just because, I mean, it's can't get in there real easy because you have the crank in the way. Without taking that off the bike, it can be a pain. There's brushes and everything for it, but it just never does quite as good as taking it all the way back apart. So you want to make sure the chain's pretty well dry before you put it back on. You don't want to sling stuff everywhere. You're just going to create a lot of dust and or places for dust and dirt to stick on your bike.
That type of crank, is there anything you can do with those without bringing it to the shop?
Yes and no. It does require, you can, but there's not a whole lot there to do it. Shimano does a really good job. They designed this crank set to be somewhat maintenance free. If the threads were looped good and it was torqued properly when you put the bearings in, it should be in there for quite some time before you have to do anything. The bearings that are actually inside here, like I said, they make something to service it. It's about popping the seals off of those cartridge bearings. But honestly, it's cheaper to replace them than the time and effort that you spend doing that. It's just as good to put a new set of bearings in, honestly. And that's part of the thing with sealed cartridge bearings versus the old loose balls. Is they're inexpensive and easy to replace. I think there's a few companies that still do strictly, and Shimano is one of them, that still strictly does loose ball bearings on the wheels. They do it because they have a special, what they call an angular contact on their thing. Instead of applying pressure straight side to side, Shimano applies it at 45-degree angles, so where it's never really side loading the bearing. So it rolls smooth and you can get good adjustment on it. Because with the sealed cartridge bearings, whenever you put a bearing in, unless it has a cone on it that adjusts the side load on it, which puts pressure on it and can tear the bearing up faster, they're really